Okay, so we are going to continue here talking about the Proverbs, chapter 26. Now this episode is beginning in the middle of a detour, a departure from the verse that we were currently in. We were exploring two verses that were coupled together. Again, in chapter 26 of the Proverbs, we were looking at verse 24 and 25. He that hates disassembles with his lips, and lays up deceit within him. When he speaks fair, believe him not, for there are 7 abominations in his heart. I found myself reflecting on verse 25, the second part of that. And for the life of me, I couldn't understand what 7 had to do with anything. And it wasn't just in this verse. That pattern was seen elsewhere. Actually, in chapter 26, the number 7 is mentioned. And I thought at the time that 7, the most obvious 7, was the 7 days of creation. But at the time, either by laziness or by lack of connection, I failed to really associate this number 7 and then the specific days in Genesis of creation. And so what ended up happening was that I took this detour, since I was prompted by this verse, to consider the 7 abominations of the heart, where each one of these numbers can be seen as a pillar that supports the principled identity of the heart, which is a fundamental component of man's experience. It is a part of his mind. The heart is often seen as this seat of feeling or of desire. And so if we are to understand that each day is a pillar, it has a rich symbolic significance in and of itself. If we flip it on its head, then we will understand what exactly is meant by the 7 abominations. And so this is where we are going to continue, all the way back to chapter 1 in Genesis. Now, looking here, I believe we finished just before the ending of the 5th day. So for our purposes, that means a number of things. This gives us a good opportunity to reflect on elements of the last episode, to outline that pillar, the 5th pillar of the heart, and then to invert it to understand what the abomination is. So the question at the present, where do we begin? It seems like there's such richness in Genesis. And starting up this conversation again from the previous episode is quite the task. There are a lot of different elements that we have found moving back and forth here. Symbolism cannot be understated. Without symbolism, we would lose a lot of our understanding and of the value, I would say. There's been talk of information, orienting information, gathering of information, recognition of identity, In a sense, it involves the recognition of independence, of agency, but also of relatedness, which I've spoken of many times before in my reflection on the Proverbs, but not so much here in Genesis, but it's equally as important. And I think that I was listening to a talk given today, and it reminded me of the importance of relatedness. Moreover, the importance of relatedness to identity. That for something to exist, it is not possible for it to exist in a vacuum. There needs to be something that it relates to in order for it to be given or afforded its own agency. And we may ask, well, fundamentally, what does this? What is the thing that bestows agency or separates things such that we are allowed to understand or identify something? And so far, we are given this term, the firmament, for which we are also given the equivalency, that of heaven, capital H, heaven. And this firmament has the capacity to separate, to divide, but also to bring together in a strange way. By the very act of division, I think we see an act of combination. Now, what exactly do I mean by that? Well, if the firmament is going to be something that divides the waters from the waters, that before this point there were aspects of information that possibly could be seen as separate, but they didn't. They weren't, because it was part of a broader whole of information. If the information is suddenly split, and now certain qualities are identified and associated with different types of waters, that of the waters above and the waters below, then suddenly we have an identity that forms. An identity that forms subsequent to the division. And it's not just this. By the action of God, we have this congregation, this consolidation of waters together to form material and purposeful, we could say purposeful matter to a degree, but purpose in general. Matter that is organized for some purpose, that can find itself within the agentic arena, forming life and cells that execute purposes, that have a degree of self-interest, a degree of agency, a degree of will. We could think of material that is almost opposite of this, that of inanimate matter, that may follow certain laws, a certain direction, but in a broad sense, not in the agentic sense, not in the willful sense. The verse that I had left off on was verse 22, "And God blessed them, saying, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let the fowl multiply in the earth." If we are to go back to verse 20, at the beginning of the 5th day, it reads, "And God said, Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that has life, and fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. And God created great whales, and every living creature that moves, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let fowl multiply in the earth." So on the surface, I hesitate here because when I was younger, I could not have fathomed the interpretation that would have satisfied the adult. When I was younger, I found an interpretation that an adolescent would enjoy, that an adolescent mind had the capacity to understand. But as I got older, and my mind became rebellious and unable or unwilling to find that deeper meaning, I lost interest. But of course, it wasn't until I came back to it as an adult and I had found an interpretation that was spurred by my own desire to understand and to know, that it became profoundly meaningful. And as I mentioned before, this symbolic quality to the Bible, to Genesis here in particular, is fundamental to our interpretation. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let the fowl multiply in the earth." In order not to get caught in some superficial interpretation, we have to remember exactly where we are. Starting in verse 21, I think, will be sufficient. But for a broader overview of this day, I would refer one back to the previous episode. "And God created great whales, and every living creature that moves, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind. And God saw that it was good." I'd like to draw the attention here to the waters. The waters brought forth abundantly. And what can this possibly mean? Why would we be referring to waters here? The waters I have been associating with information. And I mentioned the two basic types earlier. But as we found in this chapter, there is this gradual process of consolidation and division, separation, identification. Identification then depending on some relationship, some environment. And one example of that is the great whale. The great whale is a broader symbol, a symbol of some identity that finds itself within a chaotic, unconsolidated environment. It must move in particular ways, it must be in particular ways to perpetuate its own identity. It must interact with like species. It must participate in the chaotic environment. So today is a new day. And I was just thinking about that previous recording. I'm not really satisfied with that summary of the previous material, but I do want to move forward. And so if anybody is interested, I would again refer them back to the last episode. But given some of the themes that I had touched on, when we look at this verse 22, "And God blessed them, saying, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let fowl multiply in the earth." I wish to take a symbolic interpretation. I don't necessarily wish to deny the physical interpretation of this. There's an obvious material component. But I want to start in the very beginning of the verse and be meticulous as I try to be in the Proverbs. So we're going to start with God blessed. So beginning with the Latin, we have the word benedicere, meaning to speak well of or to praise. The combination of the Old English usage and the Latin concept of speaking good led to a broader meaning, to be divinely favored or regarded with approval. Now, of course, many of us, myself, I look at this word bless and I think of something that, if something is to be blessed, it is to have God's favor. But this is ultimately unsatisfying to me. For okay, we have some idea of a unified identity that is responsible for the first. It is the first cause. And everything is identified with this thing. But it really doesn't tell us much about how we ought to understand how this comes down to us. It's enough, I suppose, to have a concept in the mind that there is such a thing as favor in life. There's such a thing as being looked down upon favorably by forces that are outside of our control. Of course, there are many logical dilemmas that we might run into. Well, how do we know if this is actually God's doing? What is God's doing? Putting aside arguments like, is there a God? How is it possible that there's a God? And then tracing it through that domain. We've been there. We've done a lot of that. We're past that. It is the case for me now, though, that the term blessed is not enough. I don't wish to have some placeholder. And so this Latin influence, perhaps I'll pick this apart a little bit more, to speak well of. Many times I find if we look at our own experiences and we find ourselves reflecting on the simple things that we do, we can put a lot of meaning behind it, or perhaps we don't. I think about two examples. One in which the heart is sort of on board, there's an emotional component to speaking well of something, and then more of a corporate speaking well of, a professional. Not that the emotions can't be along for the journey in this regard, but usually it's more of something that is reasonably determined and then acted on because of some responsibility, which is not bad in and of itself. But surely, in my opinion, when the heart is on board, the experience of life is so much more full and worthwhile. And so I wish to imagine a situation in which the heart is on board, as I'm speaking well of. To praise is another interesting term, but I'll put that aside for the moment. So if I'm truly speaking well of something or someone, I truly believe that there is goodness found either in the relationship or something that I had observed about that person. Perhaps both. I would imagine that it would be usually both. But what's most interesting here, I think, is it's the concept of believing, feeling like, understanding, that there is a positive affirmation, there's a positive bias, there's a positive direction that one can take to see something. What exactly does that mean? Well, I imagine in my mind, just as I have before with regard to the firmament, that it somehow exists of the heaven, but also is the heaven. I think of our experience as agents with this bizarre sense of self-awareness, of consciousness, of the ability to reason, surely to problem solve. And I think about variability for sure, and the impossibility of our condition, how unlikely it is that we have formed in the exact way that we have formed. I think both of our limitations, but also of our strengths. And within this domain, regardless of what seems to be the trajectory for our being, or our coming to be, I find myself thinking about that soup, the substrate that we rest in, the substrate that our minds rest in. And I don't mean to say the substrate of the material, although that is a massive component of it. What I mean here is more of what both types of information, the waters above and the waters below, what exactly that environment is that the information rests in. So again, that would include material and also purposeful information, both of the animate and of the inanimate. And the concept before the waters are split, I find fascinating. That of a place of intelligibility, but also a place of absence, a place of concepts, but also a place of information that is unseparated and in a way unidentified. Unidentified in the sense that the two fundamental aspects of information that we seemingly understand, that of the minded, the purposeful and the meaningful, and that of, again, the material, the raw matter. I think of that soupy pre-second day environment, second day of Genesis. And I think this is important because going back here is a reflection on one of the first pillars of the heart, and as we talked about before, the inversion of which is the complete covering of an agent in darkness towards nothingness, purposelessness, informationlessness. But that pillar stands strong as long as we exist, regardless of if we choose to deny it. But the sense of blessedness, the sense of wellness, the sense of goodness, I mean this literally, and I mean this also, I think, in a physical sense. The mind is able to sense these things, these concepts. I suppose, in a way, we can say that there are some that are relative, in the sense that we say one person may say something is good, or they speak well of somebody, but somebody else may say that the opposite is good. Or in fact, when somebody has spoken well of somebody else, the interpretation by some other party is the exact opposite. Now, I don't deny that this possibility exists, but also I think the absolute situation exists, for which a person identifies something that which is good, and it's valuable not just on the part of the subject, but also on the part of the broader cosmic whole. And that language, I think, is fuzzy. It really doesn't mean much, so I'll have to use a better way to describe this. Thinking about the information environment, and thinking about the possibility of things that may exist within this environment, it would seem that the possibilities are almost endless. But certainly such a system, there would be things that we would consider good. On a fundamental level, I suppose, that which is good would be the preservation of that system, or of intelligibility, of a degree of order, but also a degree of liberation and exploration. That much like the laws of the inanimate world that we are so fond of removing ourselves from so that we can see it, independent of our own potential error, that realm that we occupy, that we just cannot separate ourselves from, the subjective experience, I think there is as much truth to be found there as there is in some law, some physical law for which we can depend. This is a belief that I feel is difficult to prove, but it's reasonable in my mind to believe. But much like the physical world, there's much that we don't understand. There's much that we don't understand about the way the mind understands goodness. For there are many things that I think we can imagine that would seemingly give us pause and ask, how could that be? Like in cases of war, in cases of just abject human annihilation, the annihilation of innocence, perhaps, the existence of unfortunate human beings that are extremely deformed or have a partially or misshapen mind, in the sense that the agent is not a complete agent as an average human being would be. We have people that have extremely low IQs and extremely high IQs, and yet all of this participates in this environment. And it seems messy. It seems quite messy. But surely there is order, there is dependability once we look in there and find it. On the physical level, we've come quite far at identifying things that are reliable, regardless of the deformations that may result from the material world. But this sense of the blessed, I think, includes the immediate sense, just as my immediate senses may be picking up my perception of the table as I run my finger across it. But it also includes information as we know the scientific information to be, information that is out of reach to us in a sense. But as we go through different experiments, we gather information together to find patterns about the environment, then a bigger picture is afforded to us, something that we couldn't necessarily comprehend before that experience was undertaken. And in this way, history, human experience, the experience of transpersonal agents, human societies, the ebb and flow of such things, the rise and fall of empires, All of this, I think, contributes to our understanding of who we are and of how we ought to relate to this environment, because there are common patterns that are consistent in our experiences. And there are things that can be seen as true, just as we can come to some, what we would say, as objective understanding of that which is true about the physical world. And so, although we are not necessarily, or maybe we are, in a way, talking about things that are blessed, in the sense that we are following the chain for which something becomes blessed, I suppose in a way we are, as we go through Genesis, as we come through that muddied environment, I'm saying muddied loosely, of this information that is chaotic, it's spread out across the void. The Spirit of God just hovering over this information, this potential. And then suddenly, across all of it, there is understanding. There's understanding, but also actionable potential. There is light. This is separated from the darkness, that which has yet to be permeated by that light, but also not completely void of information. It's possible in the absolute sense of absence and of darkness that we can have such a thing. We find ourselves then reflecting on the firmament and the way that it divides things and creates identities in its wake, all the way up to further and further consolidation, separating, dividing, consecrating, concentrating, conserving, all of these terms that imply some withness, some within, identity, liberation, but also conservation. And so when I see this word blessed now, as I reflect on the previous verses that we've gone through, what is being blessed here is that very causal process. And what we are seeing is that is being blessed as a snapshot of that process. And God blessed them referring to the great whales, every living creature, every winged fowl. They're being blessed because they are a part of this consolidation. They are part of a separation and yet unification that participates. Although they are separate in a way, they have their own domains, their own agency. They are connected in the way that the first cause is connected. Be fruitful and multiply. So how can we understand this, be fruitful and multiply, in the broad context of what we were talking about? With the intelligible soup, the information soup, the information landscape. Now I want to be careful here not to add something that is not meant. But just like the Proverbs, I think we are afforded certain liberties. Here, what we are being asked to consider is something that is highly material, but also highly symbolic in the sense that there are multiple terms here that may have more than one meaning. We have a few terms that are reoccurring and surely refer back to earlier patterns. And this is something that cannot be ignored in a book like this. God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply." Now this, I believe, is a line that is fairly straightforward. It is something that is common in our lexicon, our cultural lexicon, be fruitful and multiply. A call to be productive, to continue that sense of agency, that general sense of agency through time, despite the limitations of selfhood. This is not a barrier or limitation to the productive effort. Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let fowl multiply in the earth. These last two, I think, are important. And we may refer back to that first bit. But fill the waters in the seas. Again, this is something that could be quite straightforward. We could be literally, or physically rather, talking about filling that space within the large body of physical water with life. But again, given that we've already spoke extensively about the way in which the waters certainly mean something more than just two hydrogen and an oxygen. It is not the physical representation that truly defines waters in this sense. And moreover, the use of the word, using waters instead of water, I find interesting. And so I think that this probably refers to waters in the sense that we have been discussing thus far, as we've been exposed to in verse 2. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. The waters being that informational landscape, disorganized perhaps, but fundamental in the sense that that informational landscape is the fundamental building blocks of all, at the very least, this agent that is speaking is able to exist on, let's say, to interface, to be allowed to interface with. And so to fill the waters in the seas is to occupy that potential that is there, to occupy that underlying substrate for the agentic arena to expand itself. And let the fowl multiply in the earth. Now this is something that we have seen before. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that has life, and fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven." A rich symbol of a creature and of a tool, in some sense, an aspect of God or an expression of God, this firmament of heaven. A thing much like a tool that has given identities to so many things, that has within it these governing structures being that which gives intelligibility to The fowl being this creature that is a result of more fundamental processes that have taken place. The fowl seemingly returning to this place, and yet somehow not destroyed by its return, in the sense that I see the firmament as something that divides so that it can separate but yet identify and unify. When the bird returns, it's not as though the bird is split into two in some symbolic sense. It retains its identity. And one must wonder, in such a cinematic illustration, what exactly is all of this moving towards? And the evening and the morning were the fifth day. So we've gone through that transitionary period. The evening from light to dark, and from dark to light. And we begin the sixth day. But at this time we have to stop and pause and think exactly where we are in terms of the principled component of the heart. So I will read the fifth day once again, and then discuss this principled component of the heart as being that fourth, or the fifth, pillar, and then talk about its inversion, or the abomination. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that has life, and fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. And God created whales, and every living creature that moves, which the waters brought forth abundantly, after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let fowl multiply in the earth." An experience of consolidation, a further separation, in the sense that the more we consolidate information into specific beings, specific agents, specific kinds of things, specific ways of interacting with the environment, we find ourselves again at once utilizing the productive potential, but also moving away from that more generalized informational identity. And now the landscape is becoming highly specific. But what does this mean exactly? Well, it means that each one of these agents, each one of these moving creatures that has life, now lives within a space and a domain that they must reconcile and contend with these differences, but also make wise choices, meaningful choices, independent, seemingly independent, of the process that had brought them to be. Now there is a relationship, no doubt, between that first cause and their productive pursuits. But there is a willful aspect, I think, to their existence. And this willful aspect to their existence doesn't necessarily guarantee their survival, nor does it guarantee their productivity. But they have the opportunity to do so, to create and to further this consolidation, however limited their agency might be. And so, with regard to the heart, I've often referred to the heart in a certain light, in the sense that it may appear as an industrial factory, a machine that is constantly producing these fundamental emotions, most of which, will be tied to our reason, some of which may precede our reason, some of which may come after. But that productive engine that is the heart, the seat of our feelings and our desires, after going through Genesis, I begin to think more and more about the potential of the heart. That it is something that surely takes effort in certain respects to produce feelings, especially in a directional sense, but that's more of a marriage between our reason and our feelings. From my own perspective, the way that I experience life is highly emotional. Now, I temper my emotions so I can make effective decisions, but I feel all of the time. There's not a time that I'm not feeling something. Sometimes it can be quite difficult to challenge these emotions. Or to channel, I should say, not to challenge. Sometimes the emotions are to such a degree that I wish to stop them, to pacify them, to engage in something that would give me relief from the tumult, the constant roaring of their aggression. But as I reflect on it now, and despite my, at times, desire to completely put a stop to them, and these days there's no shortage of unfortunate tools for us to distract our attention and to satisfy the heart, and perhaps leave us vulnerable to control by some other agent. That's a separate matter, but the abundance of feeling, however directed, reminds me of these waters. It reminds me that this process is constantly occurring within us. Although we may reflect on the broad pattern of the expansion of life, the consolidation of the waters, and the continual action of the firmament of heaven, that this, even within me, this separation, further identification, consolidation, production and growth, this is a process that I cannot control. I can control how I relate to it, but ultimately my being and my identity is not just insular. It is not something that is completely cut off from all that is outside of me. For despite the fundamental division that I consider when I think about the firmament dividing the waters from the waters, the division of the waters are not completely separate. The division is conceptual, so that we can see the two. They are later combined to form, again, the animals as we see here, agents more generally. And so this intermingling of things, of the fundamental separation of something, so that it can be identified, so that it is intelligible, so that it is usable, programmable, perhaps. That aspect of things is fundamental, but its convergence and reintegration is also fundamental for the propagation of what I'll call as thingness. For something to exist, it must undergo this process. And in our hearts, concerning practical matters, experiential matters, Lately I've been thinking about, there's many things I suppose that are on my mind, but one thing in particular is about my, I guess in a broad sense, my place in life. About where I wish to walk, where my next steps ought to be, how I ought to adjust myself when I find myself taking these steps. And the process is somewhat uncomfortable because there is this sense of splitting. But what is exactly being split? It's hard to say. It's contextual to a degree. I'm splitting myself from things that are familiar, things that are known, and then I'm further identifying different things. But then I have to reintegrate and consolidate that information in a different way, such that I am able to move forward, again, take that step. I think we can boil this down to the process that we experience in terms of information processing within our minds. We have that of perception and attention. We focus on relevant information. We filter out distractions. We try to perceive data that is meaningful. What's most important here is that selective attention, emphasizing critical details, separating them from irrelevant ones, laying the groundwork. We have chunking and categorization, grouping similar pieces of information together. Simplifying complex information, laying down memory. Categorizing concepts into mental folders or themes, making it easier to draw parallels or to associate different ideas or information. We encode and we integrate information in the mind. We link information to prior knowledge. We associate the new data with existing memories or frameworks. We create a deeper understanding. Elaborative encoding involves attaching meaningful context to information, which strengthens the neural architecture or infrastructure. And we have reversal and consolidation. Full disclosure, I am reading a source online here. But all of this is intuitive, I think, to a sense. The very fact that we have consolidation and separation is highly consistent with what we've been talking about so far. For this rehearsal and consolidation, we're considering long-term retention. Active recall, such as summarizing or teaching the information to somebody else, this reinforces memory pathways, solidifies organization in the mind. During sleep, the brain undergoes consolidation. Here is a pattern of nighttime. This is the darkness. This is evening as consciousness wanes into that unconscious state. This process of consolidation where short-term memories are reorganized and stored as long-term memories, further integrating information into existing mental frameworks. And just to go back to what I was saying about the darkness, that it is not always the case that when we talk about darkness, we are talking about absence or the void. Sometimes when we are talking about the darkness, we are talking about the absence of mind and purely processing. The agent may not be chiefly involved in a willful sense in this reorienting of information or integration of information. We have application and synthesis, productive thought is not just about remembering, but also about applying knowledge. It involves analyzing information to extract those principles, comparing it with data, generating new insights. We have evaluation and metacognition. Metacognition is thinking about thinking. Helps monitor and adjust the approach to information and organization. Now, metacognition is almost all of what we are engaged in here with our religious pursuits. Perhaps not all, because what seeks to be integrated here is more than just one's own inner thoughts. But this helps us reflect and identify gaps in understanding, improve cognitive strategies, improve processing and thought production over time. And so I had to go there to the language model to give some extra words to the processing of the brain. This is something that I think we all know experientially. And given the outline here in Genesis, that this is something that must have come about through many years of memory consolidation, perhaps of forgetfulness at certain periods. I consider the amount of time that has passed. I think about all the lives that were lived in order to come to this conclusion, to these conclusions. But going back to what I was talking about the pillars of the heart, as we progress in these days of creation, it's becoming more and more complex, but each progressive pillar, includes aspects of the one that were before. Almost like a staircase more than it is about structural themes that support the identity of the heart. I would have to imagine if that there was something about a person's interface with the world at day one, that everything downstream would have a fundamental impact. That the processing, that the experience of life just would be a bit off. And I think of certain pathologies of mind here. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle, and creeping thing, and beast of the earth after his kind." And it was so. And so I think what we're looking at here is a further consolidation. It doesn't matter the exact sequence, but what matters is that things are becoming more specific, more consolidated. And God made the beast of the earth after his kind, and cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps upon the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good. So here I find this interesting, because it could be mistaken that I read the same verse twice, which is not the case. What I read here was verse 24 and 25. So again, and God said, "Let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping thing, and the beast of the earth after his kind." And it was so. And God made the beast of the earth after his kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps on the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good. So the fundamental distinction here is between saying and doing or making. So saying is a creative process. It involves integration of information, but it involves the integration of the waters above to produce this consolidation of thought, or productive energies, that produces the concept. The concept precedes the material underpinning. Just like verse 1 in chapter 1, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. The earth was without form and void. It was, for all purposes, I think, a concept. And so I think, although these two verses can be seen as something simple, we can expand them based on some of the earlier themes that we had touched on, but I don't think it's necessary here. The important reflection is those two causal events, that the concept precedes the physical action, the physical consolidation. Now, not always, but usually I have a notebook in front of me, and I happen to have it here now. And there's an image that I draw when I'm speaking that has repeated a few times, and that is this image of the firmament that separates the waters above and below. And the image always leads to this separation, as I've spoken about. The information then consolidates on a certain point in terms of the information above, let's say. There are plenty of different data points here for which that information landscape can be visualized or conceptualized. Once something is certain, once a concept is realized, information is then consolidated within this domain, within this dimension. Within the dimension below, the waters below, the same process seems to occur, at least in my mind. It makes the most sense for it to, that the information consolidates onto something that serves as the support, the bedrock for that concept that is above. So today is a new day. It happens to be a Sunday evening before the week begins. And I'm in a particularly reflective mood. The perpetual problem of my mind is finding exactly what to reflect on, what to focus on. Sometimes when I'm with other people, I find my mind going blank, or at least the perception of blankness or of absence. Of course, something is there. There is the awareness of that absence or that darkness. And even in that darkness, that awareness understands that the darkness isn't void per se. It is not something that, by its very structure, is given to distance, given to inability. But rather quite the contrary, it is of potential. It is yet to be manifest. And from my own experience, I find at times the experience and the awareness of the potential. And at times I have to wonder, I have yet to reach a conclusion, if this perceived darkness, this perceived potential, if the reason in the situation of my silence is because of some error, some fundamental error, some sin of lethargy, perhaps a type of paralysis, an existential paralysis. I find myself uncertain in the most seemingly innocuous situations that would not really require certainty at all. I feel confused. For example, today I had a good outing with some friends. I had some work to do, unfortunately, so I brought my laptop. But as I was in the car, in the passenger seat, this came up, this reflection, and also the feeling, which was somewhat suffocating, that I felt this urge to do, to say, and yet nothing would come. And my mind hesitates. I don't think it's the situation that it is because the mind is incapable of forming thought or forming speech. Of course, I do that all the time. It is part of my working life and responsibility, my duty. And I do it in front of this microphone. But there are times where it is undeniable that the silence within me seems to be so loud that it almost disrupts any willful thought, any reason that would subdue it, and it just exists there, producing a strong feeling in me, a strong sense of something. But I can't quite put my finger on it. And so I spend my time thinking about this thing. Sometimes there is this more explicit reflection, and sometimes, again, it's just this bathing in this soup of intensity, for which I feel imprisoned by. And I'm thankful to a degree for it. I'm more thankful for Genesis here, because now I'm thinking and reflecting on this experience that I've had for most of my life. And I'm starting to be able to put shape to it, that within that space I find myself looking at potential, but it seems uncertain, it seems inanimate, like the waters below. But it seems to hum something awful or awe-inspiring. I suppose it depends on my constitution at the particular moment. Perhaps it is fear that prevents me from taking it, from seeing it. Perhaps, like I mentioned, it's lethargy. Or perhaps it is a desire for something a little bit different. There is a concern that the path that my mind embarks on will take too much time to find something that is meaningful within that landscape. Perhaps my mind thinks that whatever it finds, it'll be too much for a given circumstance or situation, so it feels it would rather just sit and be passive, and not to burden those for whom I am with. Maybe it's all of the above. But one thing is certain, that as I grow my faith, I grow in the understanding that if I choose to act on it, it ought to be because that productive potential in front of me is an invitation. It is not something to be feared. It is not something to let pass me by, but to be something that is taken and used, built. But again, I struggle with this, because I feel whatever effort that needs to be put forth, it cannot be minimal. And almost it is the case, in my experience, that if I take a step that is too small or too short, then that step, the feedback that I get about my weakness, is enough to send such a pain through me, through my mind, as though I feel that I've committed some great sin, which of course I have not. This part of me I don't understand very well. But regardless, it produces in me a silence, a skeptical silence, a silence of hesitation. And I think I ought to call it weakness, even if it truly is not, so that I am not tempted by it. There's so much in saying. It seems as much, if not more, as there is in doing. And even now, as I explore that landscape, I feel as though I'm taking steps forward. I don't feel that they are too short or aggressively long. I feel like I know where I am. And yet, in the presence of others, it seems the superficial, for which I know my conversation must rest at times, is not sufficient to energize my spirit. This is something that I need to work on. So with that being said, we have to decide if we are going to stay here in verse 24 and 25. I wonder if there's anything else to be said about the categories that are being presented here. Some of this is familiar. A living creature after his kind, the cattle, creeping thing, the beast of the earth, which is an interesting category, for which you would imagine the cattle would find itself in, but it doesn't. It's also interesting that there is a specificity after the living creature for cattle, the beast of the earth, and the creeping thing. All of these are living creatures. So why put forth the effort at making further distinctions if there's not some significance? And as we've discussed before, there is in fact a significance. both in terms of mentioning a broad category, like in terms of the fowl, there's two meanings there. One is the broad category of the animals that take to flight. The other is the type of consolidation of information and the way that that is represented in relation to the firmament, that it can return to such a powerful structure without its own identity being dissolved. It can fly above the earth in a strange way. It is of material, but it doesn't stay within the domain that the firmament had separated. Or maybe I should say that God had separated. But ultimately the firmament served as the barrier. And so that barrier is not restrictive to complex identities. Another thing that I had mentioned within the reflection of myself about this potential that I see before me, that certainly is the waters that are beneath. And this is going to bleed, I think, wonderfully into the next verse, verse 26. I'll have to try my best to remember it, but let the earth bring forth the living creature. The earth is this inanimate material or object. It is formed of the waters below. It doesn't have that conscious, purposeful, directive agency to it. But just because it is dark in that sense doesn't mean it is void of structure, as I've mentioned. And so an interesting image appears of the matter, of the relatively meaningless matter, being the substrate that forms heavenly expressions. The waters above congregate. And we find interesting aspects to this reality. We find the living, a term in and of itself, magical. Living. For how can such a thing occur, given just, purposeless material? Of course, organization of information. But it is directed organization that causes this to be. The cattle, a symbol I'm sure we'll come back to. Cattle, I think of an animal that fulfills human purposes. Animals that are fit to live alongside human beings. Docile. The creeping thing, I think of bugs. Of the broader symbolism, surely in Genesis there is a great expansion of that meaning of the serpent. the beast of the earth. I think of a general pattern that is wound up within it. I think of the predators of the earth in the animal kingdom. But more importantly, I think of their experience. I think about their awareness relative to ours. I think about the term beast, really what it implies. The type of experience, the type of agent that occupies that term, that identity. And of this identity, I think about a symbol. I think of the agentic arena as a whole. The beast being one agent that participates in a vast array of potential agents. Where the beast, at least to the human conception, given what he understands, represents something that is base, that there are certain qualities that seem to him beneath him. They seem wild, untamed, morally neutral, almost in the sense that inanimate objects or meaningless material is morally neutral. And it is quite an interesting thing, I think, to think about the beast as an evolution, an elevation of matter, and yet it occupies a space of heaven that is so low that it just transcends the state of matter. Now, this may be unfair, but at least in terms of heavenly principles, I think that this may be accurate. Because here, of course, I think about other agents that we might say are more simplistic, like a plant, for example. A plant we wouldn't necessarily consider to be beast-like, and yet its processes, its interactions with the environment, are not as complex. I suppose that can be argued, but there is something a bit different when comparing a plant to an animal. The moral condition of animals and of plants seems to be one that is less intelligible. Though in a broad sense, I do think they occupy that space because they have been endowed with life and that heavenly spark, or the consolidation of the waters above, or meaningful, purposeful experience and existence. And the amazing thing is, all of this doesn't just exist in the conceptual sphere. I can walk outside and I can see it. I can experience it. Granted, much augmented by a lot of concrete and asphalt, at least where I live. But nonetheless, I can still find the beauty of nature and of life. Surely there are plenty of human beings, which we will get to in the next verse. And so the last reflection, I think, in verse 25 that I think is good and useful is the expression that we've seen many times before, and God saw that it was good. Every time, I think we are seeing a repeat of something that we saw before, a further consolidation, a further using of those productive energies that may otherwise be considered dark and void of the purposeful hand. But I think it's useful to note that these productive energies are considered good, because so often I find myself searching for a solid definition of that which is good. But here we have plenty of examples that there's some obvious causal trajectory that God considers good. And again, it seems to me that this causal pattern is the progression or of the realization of the waters below and the integration from the waters above into something that is self-directed, agentic, like God. And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So beginning with the first part of this verse, "And let us make man in our image," I find that to be an interesting use of language. That there is this plurality that is referring to the principal identity, the first cause, God. And what's interesting, as I think about my own experience, often I find myself thinking in terms of we or in terms of us. It's kind of a funny thing. And I also have this internal dialogue, as if they were two parts of myself. Of course, I can imagine that there are plenty of parts to myself, and yet there is one self. There is a unity here. There is not a plurality of people that exist within me. But all the same, this concept of having multiple within a singular identity is a pattern that is recurrent. Not only just in my experience, but also in my conceptualizations throughout the Proverbs. I've thought of the mind as being composed of different parts. Our principal endeavor at this point is reflecting on Proverbs chapter 26. Can't remember quite the verse number that we are on, but the purpose is that we are talking about the heart. We're talking about the identity of the heart. The heart in and of itself is an aspect of mind, one important pillar of our being, and yet it occupies a degree of agency in and of itself. I think of the cells of our body that have a degree of agency in and of themselves. But to go back to this heart, within it, we identify different things that make it up. And of each individual pillar, which we are now exploring, of the 7 days of creation, in each one of them there is plenty of information to be explored, to be rationalized, to be experienced, whatever. And yet, at some level, we can say that there is a singular identity. And I find this fascinating. I don't think that this is something to be seen as indeterminate, in the sense that for something to be, even though it is wound up within different structures, whether it be a hierarchy, a hierarchy of selfhood, a hierarchy of community, a hierarchy of being, of culture. Despite this, and despite the participation of elements that form a whole, we still retain this ability to recognize what the unity is. And this matter of level, I think, is quite interesting. The question that comes to mind is, well, what exactly is this level? If we are to imagine that of the heart, for example, there's a level for which we can examine the components, the principled elements, the pillars of its identity. And yet we can examine the identity of an individual, and not just a particular part. By level, I mean to say that the identities are participating in a more unified and central identity. And as far as my mind sees, it seems that many things, even seemingly principal identities, let's take myself for example, I participate in other identities that have some centralized existence. That I'm a citizen of the United States, I'm an employee of a particular company, I am a member of a particular family. I exist at a particular level of organization, cellular organization. I can think about the level of organization as it relates to the waters above and waters below, and the integration of those. I could think of my identity as it participates in the identity of God, perhaps. That I am of an agent that shares space and the reality of things that are. But more importantly, the things that are, that have come to exist because of that first cause. That everything after owes its experience or owes its existence to that thing. And that thing is so fundamental that regardless of the degree of separation that an agent might find itself from that first cause, there is always a relationship. There is always a participation in that thing, in that identity. And just because there is this reference to a plurality within the singular doesn't negate the singular, but it does point to the interesting, I want to say, dilemma or question of these two things, multiplicity and singularity. There's something of an image in my mind, and I think about the singular in terms of God, that is recognizing the aspectual nature of himself. And this aspectual nature is affording the singular of the human being. The human being, of course, is aspectual as well, formed of many components, but still occupying the singular identity. And let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. And so what I see here is a relationship, almost like a kingly relationship, that the human being occupies over the various strata of the animal kingdom. But these strata, I would not say, is limited to just the animal kingdom, though it is easy to see, I think, within the animal kingdom that when we are talking about, at least symbolically, these types of animals, at the lowest level of life form, not in the sense of physically lowest level, but again symbolically, when something is close to the earth, it is seen as something that is more material. Now, a being that is close to the earth may be quite complex and sophisticated. It may be more complex than a bird, for example. But this is not really what we're talking about, I think. When something is close to the earth, it has more of this inanimate, procedural, limited way of existence. And as we move up these levels, I think what we find, at least symbolically, is agents that are more and more in tune with the heavenly domain. They are of that material substrate, that raw material, but in the end, that existence is more purposeful. And again, the point here is not necessarily to draw exact conclusions to the physical organisms that we see. The human being is at the top of that hierarchy in terms of purposeful action. The human being occupies the space above the bird, I would say, in terms of the relationship to the heavens, to the likeness of God. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. Now this pattern returns to us from moving from saying to doing. God said, "Let us make man." So God created man. The heavenly concept that is given to, afforded to, the material substrate, such that that principle can live, such that it can exist, or at least exist in the way that we would recognize it. The wording is interesting here. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female, he created them. And this makes me think about something that I had just discussed about this multiplicity and singularity situation. Thinking about images and thinking exactly what makes an image. There's an image actually on the page of the Bible that I'm looking at. Half of the one page is a full image. The title is The Creation of Light. An interesting sort of image, but the thing that I was reflecting on was more so the traditional definition of what many of us would consider to be an image. that it is some representation, perhaps it could be art, but it is some visual stimulation in the physical sense that may convey information about something, information that is not necessarily written, but rather seen as some representation. And there's an aspect of this that I think covers the broader definition of what is image, the term image. In the broader definition, it includes, I think, both the physical, the perceptive, but also the moral and the spiritual, the abstract, the conceptual. And as far as I can see, I see many images in my mind. Of course, they are not given to paper. They may not even necessarily have a form in the physical sense. It has a form in a sense, but perhaps not a physical form. Abstraction is an interesting sort of experience. But of male and of female, we can imagine their physical forms. But if we imagine their poles, that of the fundamental pillar, almost like we think of conservative versus liberal as fundamental pillars of our system. Here, I think, much like we discussed the multiplicity within the singular, as in the case of the heart, I think here we have a glimpse into the multiplicity of God's potential identity. That there is this female and male image that is wound up within it. And of course we say he, because I think that God has this penetrating quality to him. That the seed is planted by his efforts. And that this is a male behavior. But also the environment for which the seed is planted is also God's. And this, of course, is feminine. It is the receiver, the nurturer. And God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." Be fruitful and multiply. Now I've spoken of what it means to be blessed, and perhaps what that means for God to bestow such an action. So I don't think I'll go into it again here. And I have touched on the be fruitful and multiply in a sense. But as it relates to the human being, it's quite interesting, I suppose. So I'd like to explore this territory just a little bit and see what we can come up with. Be fruitful and multiply. Of course, for something to be fruitful, it is productive. It is something that bears fruit. Fruit is, in this case, something that is of value. It is something that is sustaining. It is something that is nutritious, which is the extension of that sustaining element. And to sustain in this context is to maintain some sort of existence. maintain some sort of interface. There's an image in my mind that I had some time ago thinking about one of the Proverbs. And I find myself often trying to come back to it because I found it useful, but it has to do with this idea of interfacing with reality. And then I have to imagine that of our experience here and what we understand to be the universe, outside of its own vastness, I have to wonder about the operating system. I have to wonder about our programming. I have to wonder at a fundamental level about the information that goes into a given structure that has laws that govern it, just as an operating system has rules that define it. Some of them, I'm sure, are sufficiently broad to afford many different applications and programs and ways to interface, but certainly not infinite. And I think about the state of information prior to entering such a system, that it is still something, that it exists. In a way, in my mind, I think about this information traveling like electrons through a wire to meet this system, this reality that the human being finds himself in. Perhaps it's not a good analogy to think about it this way. But the main point here is that regardless, what was before was something. It had an environment of its own, and I have to wonder about not only different aspects of creation, or a creative process, perhaps, that has been conducted prior to the creative process that's associated with our universe. I think this interpretation is headed towards something that is a bit too material in the sense that it is not as purposeful as it ought to be. So I'm going to avoid that path. Because it's easy to get lost in. And it's easy also, I think, to separate identities into something that is completely alone in and of itself, like our universe is separate from other universes. And as we've discussed before, it's impossible to have an identity without relationality, or relationships in general. But at the very least, I think we can discuss potential. We can discuss probability. We can discuss that which has come to be. That which has come to be for which we do not understand and we do not know. And I think sometimes this lack of certainty in the face of so much uncertainty can be cause for some trouble. Something that is a bit unsettling. And I say this because, just thinking about my own experience, it's often the case that I may make goals, and I may be putting one foot in front of the other, one step at a time. And yet my mind is always thinking about this ultimate desire. It submits, surely, to its station, but there are times for which the mind wanders, and it desires something perhaps that it cannot have, or it desires something, a certain sense of knowing, a concreteness, a satisfaction, a peace of mind that puts the mind at ease. A type of proof and evidence that is so unshakable that there is no doubt where even the slightest step falls, even if, like in the musical sense, even if there is a wrong note. It doesn't matter, because the instrument or the understanding of notes, music in general, is enough to guide the mind towards its end, towards that purpose. And if indeed one note is struck, it's fine. It's a misstep, or generally a part of the experience, of the journey, and that perhaps it's not really a mistake. It's something to be thought about and compared to where the end goal is. And if it doesn't match up with where we wish to be in the end, then we make an adjustment. But it's the interesting experience, it's the interesting condition of man, that not everything is understood, not every end is understood. There are certain goals that are within his reach that must be approached with a certain level of humility. That if we reach too high, undoubtedly we will never reach that end. But if we participate, if we are fruitful and we multiply, we find ourselves a worthwhile partner and raise our children well, that although this is not the answer to everything, we do see within it that process of creation, the consolidation of information, that union of heaven and earth. It is something that we can do, albeit on a small scale. But if we take the time to reflect on it and to use it rightly, this experience could lend itself to the utmost satisfaction of the heart and of the mind. Of course, there are many situations that don't add up to be pleasurable or even to be fruitful in the end by the actions of those who are involved. But that is why that process of reflection and of adjustment is important. That it is not just the end and the goal in a series of steps, in the sense that once one step has been achieved, then it's autopilot to the next step. It's every single moment. There is this opportunity, there is an affordance of reflecting and of adjusting. And much like a musician plays an instrument, every note is important. A few notes here and there that don't quite add up or make sense is okay, because in the broad scheme of things, the mind can still comprehend things, it can still make sense of things, even if there are a couple pieces of the puzzle that aren't quite necessary to the overall image, theme, or whatever, meaning. And replenish the earth. Now this is something I find interesting. There are all sorts of physical images that pop up in my head, but I'm given to more of a symbolic understanding. And when I think about this replenishing of the earth, I have to ask myself, well, what exactly would constitute replenishment? Of course, we can return the earth to its original state. We can remove the principles from above from the principles below, or at least separate them into a state prior to our intervention. Because as we understand, these two things come together to form all sorts of interesting things, fundamental to our own existence. But I think this is too simple. And I think also, although important, the environmental conservation, that aspect, that approach to understanding this verse is also too simple. Or perhaps it's too complex, and the answer is just more simple and yet more elegant. I think replenishing the earth means to move it in a particular position. Now, just like politics, I think a position of a particular pole, or even of the spirit of liberty, depends exactly on where the institutions are, what the relationships are like, how the people view themselves, how they view each other. And it's not really a matter of a general conception, if the conception is false. What matters is that which is true. And if there's a way to identify something that is independent of institutional failure, or any unfortunate ailment that may result of such similar qualities, I think it can be said that as long as, following with this political analogy, and I promise I'll come back to what the main purpose of this is in a moment, as long as we are able to identify, just for the sake of example, what the true poles are, the two broad poles that have emerged in our cultural domain, political domain and cultural domain, that of the conservative and of that of the, what we might call Democrat. It's not a good term for it. The liberal, perhaps. Small L liberal, as they sometimes say. That each of these are an identity. Now there are identities that can shift and change over time, but as that happens, the name is not the same as what it was. It becomes something different and something new. But if we are to imagine something that is of first principles, a definition that is closer to first principles, and then suddenly, because of some cultural disruption or cultural contagion, the meaning behind what it means to be a conservative or what it means to be a liberal is suddenly flipped on its head, or given information that was previously antithetical to what the term originally meant, then it doesn't matter. It's nominal at best. So why do I say this? Well, in the political context, it's because a solid political mind is one that understands, at the level of first principles, major patterns of behavior, major patterns of being, in a sense, relatedness to government. And this is important because if one understands this level, then one can understand where they are relative to the changes in government, just like the changes can happen in terms of a particular pole. At least culturally it may seem that way, and then get a nominal word that really doesn't mean what it used to mean. If one can retain the first principles, retain a name for themselves so that they can understand what they are referring to in their own minds, and then as everything around them shifts, as it ebbs and flows, as it naturally does within, in my own experience, within me, within my own heart, within my own mind. Understanding that principle to the broader governing structure is fundamental to making important executive decisions, which would translate to voting, but also to policy, design, legislation. And I think in a like manner, there's a similar relationship to replenishing the earth, that is, returning it to, well, first, it's understanding the place of the earth. And it's not a matter of a dogmatic disruption of human activity to satisfy some previous condition of non-purposeful material. Of life we can make an argument, I suppose. There are many ways that we can think of this. But the earth, at least what it appears to be the case from Genesis, is that it serves as a bedrock, a foundation for heavenly principles to find their place, to make sense of, to unify to a degree, but to elevate to some purpose, to some meaning. And given that there is already purposeful material, but on a scale that is what we might say less than the human being, but yet not immaterial, yet not non-purposeful, their purposes rest at a level inferior to the possibilities of the mind of man, which is why that man is given this sort of stewardship over the earth to make such executive decisions. But again, just like the political analogy, it's important that man understands his place in relationship to the earth, both in terms of the raw substrate of material, but also in terms of the purposeful life that has emerged. And if we look at the definition on Google for this word replenish, it means to fill something up again, to restore a stock or supply to a formal level or condition. And again, here I think that there is easy confusion that I have to think about in my mind, that there's a possibility of some fundamentalist environmentalist that is out there that believes that in order to protect the earth, it is to rid it of the human being. Now, I may agree with certain elements of human action, to rid it of the human being so that the earth can recover, to fill it up again with a certain sense of, in this case, it would be a condition of life. The environmentalists wouldn't say that they wish to separate the waters above from the waters below to the point at which life doesn't exist on Earth. That would be quite the fundamentalist environmental approach. But at least in the modern context, contemporary environmentalists seem to have this fervor to reduce the human action. But to the credit to such a viewpoint, it is the case. It probably always will be the case that on the broad scale, the reflection of Adam, the reflection of man, in the broad sense, will always yield some modification to his actions and to his behaviors. There will always likely be some externality for which he had not foreseen, and this has to be taken into account. When he reflects, of course. But the question remains, this term replenishing, what is being filled up? What is being restored? What is that formal level or the condition? Well, I would say that the former level is only a former level if one is to believe that something has truly been depleted. And I will not here go into my belief, my conception about the potentials of an environmentalist so I can rebut them. We are beyond that illustration, that analogy. We can approach it from a few different aspects. We can approach it indeed from the place of human action, that it has gone astray, that there has been some unforeseen consequence that needs to be changed or modified. Much like in periods of political revolution, or a political awakening, maybe a better term, when man understands that things have gone in a particular direction for too long and has led to too many unsatisfactory results for the vast majority of the people that are living under such a system. Much like in music, again, the example of the wrong note or taking a wrong step or path in life. There's a certain view that I think a person can have, again, that there is really no wrong way, a wrong step, as long as the mind takes effort to correct in a way that makes sense, that leads to that fruitful end and leads to that multiplication of his experience, of his posterity. And there's a certain symbiosis, I think, that must exist between man's reproduction, but also the replenishment of the earth. And here I would like to point out that we can both examine the physical structure of Earth, but also from an informational standpoint, that we're talking about a particular type of consolidation of information. The inanimate material, the non-purposeful material, existing at that level, below the level of life, that is quite rich in terms of the productive potential for man. I'd say it's even, I won't say it's even greater, but certainly it is a fundamental building block for which man can enact his purposes and bring down the heavenly principles. So I pose another question. In what direction, then, ought this information to be directed? If we are to be these arbiters of creation, surely we must follow the days. We must follow the pattern. We must consolidate, produce identity. But produce identity for some purpose, and not at the expense of our own kind. Perhaps that is too selfish. If I take a glass of water, and I say that this is something that is important to me, and I define what is important by the purpose of the glass, but also the state of the glass, that the purpose is to hold something, and its state is that it is holding water currently, not just that it has the potential to do it. And then let's say I pour the water out of the glass. What has changed is, at least from my perspective, a fundamental quality of the identity of this thing, of the glass. Similarly, by the earth, by the information, or by the human action, or by human action and interference, I think that this relationship can be changed in a negative way. So there's an aspect of an undoing that's necessary to return or to refill. But in the case of the glass, we can't just refill it with what has been poured out. What needs to be done is that something new needs to be added, something different. And I think about the earth in this way. I think about the non-purposeful material in this way. That our very relationship to the inanimate, the non-purposeful material must change in order for us to recover the purpose of the material in the first place. That we are meant to be stewards, that we are meant to subdue it. And if we have a particular relationship with it, that what we need is a glass full of water, but what we have is perhaps a glass that is empty, but even worse than empty, that has a large hole in it, so it cannot, in the first instance, it doesn't have water in it, but in the second instance, it cannot fulfill the purpose. Now, the earth, I don't think, is in a situation where it cannot fulfill the purposes of man. Or I should say, I don't think that inanimate material is in a situation where it cannot fulfill the purposes of man. But man's utilization of such a tool, I think, is inappropriate to satisfy what he wishes to build, or what he ought to build. And so a replenishment in this context would mean not necessarily his absence, but an alteration of his relationship to that tool, a reformulation of the identity, of what's actually important about the glass, what constitutes a purposeful glass, and what exactly we ought to do with it, so that it may hold water, so that we can drink from it. It has value to us. It is not just something that is there that we think has value, or we use it in a particular way that is inefficient or purposeful on a very low level. And have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. Now here's an interesting reflection about this graduation from non-purposeful matter, non-meaningful matter, to that of meaningful existence, purposeful existence, and yet purposeful at a level that is beneath the agent that is now governing, the agent that can see higher purposes, for example, the human being. So looking forward from here, what's interesting to me is that we seem to be at this precipice for which the human experience is about to unfold. How does the human being handle the responsibility of governor, or of steward, maybe we could say. Either way. And of course we know how the story of Genesis plays out. I won't go through that here. Someday I will go over it in detail on the podcast, but not today, not this year. But just sitting here for a moment, sitting on this reflection about where we've come from, about these patterns and processes that have integrated information and have tolerated difference. It has tolerated multiplicity, but also has, in a strange way, tended towards a type of unity that was not seen in the beginning stages. Not seen in the sense that the earth was without form and void, but yet in the beginning we have heaven and earth. And of course there's a unity of God, there's a unity of these concepts, and there's this undulation between a mass environment of the waters, this mystical information environment, and then a further consolidation, the production of life, and the expansion or the consolidation of the material, whichever way we want to describe it. And of course we understand in the physical domain how this has played out as well, and how it continues to play out, that the material is quite consolidated, and yet individual galaxies are separating farther and farther apart. Of course, we always have to be careful about conflating material explanations and spiritual ones. That's not to say that there is not a relationship between the two, but again, the material serves as the bedrock for the spiritual manifestation. And so what we examine when we examine physical phenomena is not necessarily the causes of the physical phenomena and then try to relate them to spiritual causes, if we could put it that way. But rather, we understand the causes of the material world to understand more deeply the significance of the embedded spiritual principles that we consider out of them, that we reflect on, that we plant so that they grow out of them, out of that environment. But to further what I was saying, just taking the whole picture, taking the place of man in this hierarchy, that he is the governor of this particular space. And we can think about the progression of life. We could think about the progression of man's institutions, his societies, and how they have moved and progressed, how they have moved into certain unities and have disintegrated into multiplicities and have reintegrated into some unity. We could think about smaller animalistic principalities, if we can call it such a thing. We can imagine niches in which particular animals thrive and find themselves masters of a particular domain. But what I find fascinating is this general sense of consolidation. And I've been beating that word to death, but what I mean by it, at least in this particular sense, is that man's consolidation, again, this verse, and God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. And so what exactly is being consolidated here? Well, there are a number of things. Just as a parentheses here, that I think that there are particular moments that stand out more than others. Certain periods of consolidation. We could say this, that, and the other about moving from all the different levels of life up to the human being. There's plenty of fruitful things that can be imagined there. But the point at which information itself is split into that symbolic and inanimate and non-purposeful base, the period at which life emerges, and then the period at which life comes to a unity for which there is a governor over the rest of it. These are major points in the process of informational consolidation. And while our experience here certainly is not the end of it, it marks an interesting place, because undoubtedly we are going to play an interesting role in the next big event, whether that be the invention of artificial intelligence or some other participation. What I'm curious about is, in some sense, man's role as governor. But also, what exactly does this level of consolidation mean? That's all it's been in the last year discussing the Proverbs, or maybe even more, year and a half maybe, that I've been on this journey of really diving into the Proverbs. There is this profoundly intimate internal dialogue that has to take place in order for religious discussions to be grounded. And at the same time, it involves a process of discovering and of painting this grand picture of where we find ourselves in the whole thing. And we try our best to be deliberate, to be honest, to be truthful in that process. And being an American, it comes with a lot of baggage these days. But there is a culture and a tradition buried here that is available for those who are looking for it. A spiritual history of sorts, in which its founding was wrought on this wave that liberty had given to it. And liberty itself being this spirit that floats across the waters. And by extension, I think of the word sovereignty and its relationship to the word dominion, as this is the word used in the text to describe man's role over the rest of life on earth. And sovereignty, I think, much like liberty, occupies this space of the spirit, of the spiritual. That it occupies a space of power, of authority, of selfhood, of individual identity. But not individual identity for the sake of individual identity. It is the appropriate identity that levels up appropriately to the level above it and to the level below it. That of man and his situation, his relationship to his governing body, of the broader culture, of his family, of his work, and down to his relationship with the environment, with the animals and the physical structure of the world that he is so dependent upon. Now, I think I'm going to end this episode here, but I'll continue the next episode with the same line of thinking. The next episode, I know for certain that we will be done with our exploration in Genesis and return to the Proverbs. So until then, goodbye.